by my colleague. Can I ask everybody please to turn their cell phones to silent mode? I think I'll do that myself, actually, on the off chance that somebody calls me. Don't do that. Okay, good evening and welcome to the 11th Edward Said Memorial Lecture. This series was initiated by my colleague Farrell Hazul shortly after Edward's death, and this year's lecture is generously supported by the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. That is Nathaniel Bowditch, to whom we are very grateful. I also want to acknowledge Hoda and Nadia Gindi of Cairo University's English Department. Hoda's here today. Childhood friends of Edward who are here and also support the lecture series. Finally, I want to thank my administrative staff, Ola Shanab and Omneya Ali, and all of our graduate fellows for their hard work coordinating this event. Thank you very much. I'm Stephen Nimitz of AUC's Department of English and Comparative Literature, and it's a real privilege for me to be here and to introduce our speaker this evening and to welcome all of you members of the community of Cairo. Thank you for coming. Before I get to tonight's speaker, I want to give the names of previous guests who have delivered the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. These are David Damrosch, Cornell West, Terry Eagleton, Rokas de Groot, Judith Butler, John Carlos Rowe, Michael Wood, Sari Makdisi, Marina Warner, and Leila Abulagod. I know that Edward would be honored by that list of names, as he is by our speaker tonight, Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Professor Diagne is currently chair of French and Romance Philology at Columbia University, a position that he took in 2008 after having taught philosophy for many years at Sheikh Anta Diop University in his native Senegal, and then at Northwestern University. He also served in Senegal as counselor for education and culture, and he has a broad range of experience and interventions in the public sphere, where he has deployed his considerable academic acumen on many important causes, especially on behalf of universal human rights. And thus he is a very appropriate choice for tonight's lecture. Professor Diagne has been recognized for his public service and for his teaching and research by many awards and honors in France, Senegal, and in the US, including the Koldyke Outstanding Teacher Professorship, the Alfasi Prize in the Social Sciences and the Humanities, the Edouard Glissant Prize, and the Dagnan Bouveret Prize. Professor Diagne studied philosophy and mathematics at the Sorbonne, writing a doctoral thesis on Georges Boole's Algebra of Logic. This will be the only Edward Said lecture with math questions will be allowed. And not only allowed, but definitively answered, perhaps. Since then, his work and interest have branched into many fields of study, including the history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, African philosophy and literature, Sufism in the Islamic world, and 20th century French philosophy. Of his many award-winning books, those that have been translated into English include African Art as Philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, and the Idea of Negritude, Islam and Open Society, Fidelity and Movement in the Philosophy of Muhammad Iqbal, and finally, The Ink of the Scholars, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa in 2016. This last work is available online as a free download at the Codicea site, and we thank you for that. We really appreciate that here in Egypt. The subtitle of that work, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa, is also the title of his talk this evening. Please welcome Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne.
Thank you very much, Stephen. To be invited to deliver this year the Edward Said Memorial Lecture at this prestigious university in American University in Cairo is indeed a great honor, for which I would like to express my gratitude to everybody who invited me and who made my visit possible, and particularly you, Steve, for having made everything smooth, even if I did my best to complicate things for you. And I would like to thank you all for being present here. Three reasons make me particularly happy to be bestowed such an honor. First, allow me to mention a quite a trivial reason that I should not probably talk about, but allow me. Allow me to say that Edward Said's birthday, which is in the very first week of November, that is the reason why we are having this memorial lecture now, also happens to be my birthday. So it is quite a celebration for me. I could say that when I reached my, let's say, 20th spring, I delivered the Edward Said Memorial Lecture at the American University of Cairo. Okay, forget this first reason. Here is a more serious second reason. The obvious reason is that I come from Columbia University, as it was said, where Edward Said has been and still is, by his work, such a towering presence. You cannot be in the humanities or in the social sciences in Columbia University today and not feel that you are in the home of Edward Said. I joined Columbia only in 2008, too late to have met him, but of course he has been such an influence in the works of everybody in the field of the humanities and the social sciences. And the third reason connected to that is precisely the influence of his work, in particular his Orientalism, in one of my own fields of research, which is philosophy in Africa. The best example of such an influence is Valentin Moudimbe's book, known as The Invention of Africa, Gnosis, Philosophy, and the Order of Knowledge, in which Valentin examines intellectual constructs on Africa in an approach which owes very, very much to Edward Said's Orientalism. So, as I examine here in this address the history of the phrase African philosophy, I can certainly invoke the influence of Said and Moudimbe's questioning of the ideology of otherness. So let me emphasize that my lecture is about the very phrase African philosophy, or to put it differently, of the association between Africa and the concept of philosophy. Because, as I will show in my lecture, this phrase poses the question of what philosophy is and also what Africa is. When we say Africa, are we thinking about the continent as a whole, or are we, in our minds, only thinking about sub-Saharan Africa? So let me consider the history and the meaning of that association, Africa and philosophy. In very broad terms, the history of that phrase, African philosophy, is the history of a book that had been written by the philosopher and theologian Placide Tempels, Father Placide Tempels, a Franciscan missionary and Belgian citizen who was one of the first to give to a work a title, Bantu philosophy, that credited the idea of the existence of an African philosophy. What then is the history of that book, Bantu philosophy, which must be acknowledged as foundational for a whole intellectual current addressing African philosophy, even if its author, as I said, was not strictly speaking African. I say strictly speaking, since clearly philosophical activity on or in Africa is not exclusively the concern of those who are African by birth. Father Tempels arrived in what was then the Belgian Congo in the 1930s, in order to do what missionaries do when they travel outside of Europe, that is to say, evangelize and convert. And to this end, he learned the local languages, all of them belonging to the family of Bantu languages. He instructed himself in the oral culture, and he took interest in particular in the proverbs, in the ways of saying, of doing and being of the populations he aimed to bring into the Christian religion. And he was also certainly interested above all in the region's religions, because obviously if you are there on a mission and with the goal of evangelizing, you pay attention to the religion of the populations. And during the war, the Second World War, he began to write a book out of his experience in Flemish or Dutch on his knowledge of the Bantu societies among which he was living then. He believed he had come to understand the philosophy at the heart of the different aspects of the lives of those he hoped to see become followers of the church. And this is what he was looking for, precisely their philosophy. And this word in his mouth and in his mind should not be understood in a kind of diluted and banal sense of a way of seeing things or a worldview. Father Temple's thesis was that there exists a certain number of philosophical principles, or more precisely of ontological principles, because all these principles were about the conception of being of the populations he was living among. And these principles have the coherence of a true philosophical system. And they form the basis of all other spheres of Bantu society. The law of the Bantus, their religions, obviously, their art, their customs, their political institutions, all of these different spheres of activities of the Bantu for Father Temples had to come out of a finite set of ontological principles. So these are the spheres of activity were the object that ethnology had taken as the subject of its studies. But while ethnology stopped at the pure description of these spheres at the surface of things for Father Temples, philosophy, he said, must know how to descend the whole way to the fundamental explicatory principles of which these spheres are manifestation, and which lead ultimately to answering the primary question, what is being? This is the fundamental question that a theologian would pose, obviously, a theologian raised in the Aristotelian Thomist tradition. So he looked at the answer that the Bantus gave to that question, what is being? To that question, according to Father Temples, Bantu philosophy responds, first, that being is force. To exist is to exercise a certain force. Mind you, he's not saying that being has a force. In other words, it is not the attribution of a predicate force to a subject, which would be being. It is the affirmation that the two are one and the same thing. Being, in other words, force, one might say. And if you want to say it in Latin, which is always more impressive, you could say ens sive robur, to paraphrase Spinoza. This is for Temples the first of a collection of ontological axioms that he considers to be at the foundation of the Bantu's belief system. The other of which, after being is force, would be each force is individual. In other words, you do not have a monism of being, everything being a form or a modification of one single being. You have monadic individual forces. So, second principle, each force is individual. Third principle, forces exert an action upon each other. Fourth principle, the universe is a network of forces running from the force of forces, which is identified with one God, one single God, down to the mineral by way of the ancestors, the noble dead, so to say, then the living persons, then the animals, then the plants. So from the force of forces to the ancestors, to the living people, to the animals, to the plants, and to the minerals, nothing is inert. There is not any single reality which is deprived of force, or rather, I correct myself, which is not a force, which does not exercise a certain force. And from that set of principles, you can then also infer a kind of ethical principle, which would be that the purpose of a force is to increase. What does a force do? A force is always in pursuit of its own increase. And then from that particular principle, you can derive something in the sphere of ethics by saying that you define as good what increases the force, and as bad what decreases the force, the power of acting. Léopold Sédar Senghor, the poet, philosopher, and first president of my country, Senegal, who was very much impressed by Temple's book when it was first published after World War II, proposes to have the neologism deforcing to translate that. Something is good if it reinforces, and it is bad if it deforces. So that is the neologism he created in French, which can be also translated into English. So these are the fundamentals of what Father Temples considered to be the dynamic ontology that the Bantu culture carried within itself, which can be read in particular in Bantu languages. And he opposed this to a static ontology in the Aristotelian tradition, where you have a substratum, a subject which remains unchanged and permanent, receiving from outside the predicates that are attributed to it. So you can see how he built this binary, this contrast between what he considered to be a dynamic African, or more precisely Bantu, way of considering or answering the question, what is being, to what he considered to be the European understanding of being in a kind of continuous Aristotelian frame. So that is roughly summarized what Bantu philosophy says. And when the book was translated into French and published at the end of the war by Présence Africaine, the publishing company, it was a resounding success. The publishing house was literally created in order to publish the book, as its founder, the Senegalese Alioune Diop, indicated in the preface he wrote to Bantu philosophy. He declared that the book was, with another text by Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, called Black Orpheus, the most important book that was written on Africa. And he celebrated the fact that in this book by Father Temples, the notion of vital force had acquired a positive meaning which was absolutely opposed to the meaning it had had just a few years before, when the Nazis actually spoke about vital force and presented their own ideology as an ideology of vital force. And to understand the success of Temple's book, which was welcomed, as I said, as a foundational event by figures as diverse as the Senegalese Léopold Sédar Senghor, or Cheikh Anta Diop, another Senegalese, or the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, it requires to understand the break, the rupture that the book represented, beginning with its title. It broke with a way of thinking that was established at the end of the 1820s and the beginning of the 1830s, in the era when Hegel was giving his lectures on the philosophy of history in Berlin. As you know, and let me summarize this very quickly, in his lectures on the philosophy of history, Hegel was basically retracing the history of human spirit. Let's call it like that. And so he was looking at the way in which human spirit had traveled throughout the world during world history, let's say. And since he was doing that, looking at the map, he could not ignore this huge continent which seems to be sitting in the middle of the world, which is the African continent. One could think that Hegel had no desire to talk about Africa, but if you are saying something about world history and the history of human spirit in general, you can't ignore that, well, Africa is there on the map, sitting there. So he decided to say bravely something about it. He looked at the map, and you have to think of Hegel as someone who believed very much in geography. He's a philosopher of history, but a philosopher of geography as well, in the sense that for him, water was very important. Let me. For speakers also, it's very important. So a land, any given piece of land, needed to be sort of open to the water in order to be open to the infinite. The water represented a figure of the infinite. So of course, Greece was the cradle of human spirit, because Greece is basically an island and penetrated by the sea from everywhere. He looked at the map of Africa and thought, okay, here is the Nile, which I am very happy to see from my hotel. Thank you for putting me there. He sees the Nile penetrating the land, and he thought that, okay, this is good. This is the spirit penetrating the continent. So this place called Egypt is really a place where the spirit might be at home, not in its fullness, that only happens in Europe, but still at home. So he decided that Egypt and the Nile should be detached from the rest of Africa and associated with Asia. Looking again at the map, you see the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so Mare Nostrum, shared by Greece, Italy, etc., but also all the countries in the Maghreb. So he thought, okay, there is some opening here for the spirit, so, but it is Africa, it's not Europe. So it has to be somehow connected to Europe, but through colonization. And you have to remember the dates. 1830 is the moment when the French invaded Algiers. So for him, the beginning of the colonial adventure was truly something that was written in, necessarily in the history of the spirit, because the Maghreb would be now attached to Europe through colonization, and remain for him what he called Africa proper. So the question I posed at the beginning, what is Africa? In this vivisection, in this dismembering of Africa, for Hegel there was Africa proper, and he looked at the map and thought, this is too massive, not enough water penetrating the land. So he decided that the spirit could not live on the African continent. So he decided that the African continent was forever wrapped in the dark mantle of night. You could call him a racist, you would be wrong. Actually, this had nothing to do with race. He was not saying that black people were incapable of receiving the spirit or philosophy. He was saying that the geography of their continent could not. So he was not racist, he was geographist, as I would call it. So philosophizing Africa was an oxymoron from then on, and at any rate, philosophy could only be the exclusive telos of a European humanity to which, according to Husserl later on, the other humanities much align themselves. This discourse repeated itself in the ethnology of Africa, and in particular in the huge opposition that was ethnographically constructed between European reason and primitive African mentality, for example, in the thesis of someone like Lévi-Brul. So you can see now that the very title of temples associating African cultures or societies or languages such as the Bantu with philosophy was breaking with that intellectual tradition, and that explained the success of the book. The book created a genre, and that genre in turn produced a certain number of an intellectual tradition of books that were written from then on, let's say from the 1950s to the 1970s, without problem, saying a book on Igbo philosophy, Akan philosophy, Wolof moral philosophy, and so on and so forth. They were all models, these kind of book, this particular literature, on that book by Father Temples on African art. And in that essay, he also had something about a philosophy of force, which is the ultimate principle behind the very particular nature of African art. In particular, the anti-mimetic nature of that art. As you know, usually Africa is huge, so speaking of African art might be essentialist, but it is true that one can find a kind of common denominator between the arts of many different regions of Africa and pay attention to the fact that it is not a naturalist art, but an art in which figures are totally distorted. You use geometrical forms, you put together geometrical forms in a way that is not reproduction of reality, although reality is hinted. There is a hint that this represents a man, this represents a woman, this represents this or that figure, but at the same time you are not paying so much attention to the mimetic relationship to anything real. Because, said Senghor, what the artist is truly aiming at is not the reproduction of reality, but grasping the sub-reality of the object. And that sub-reality of the object is the force which it manifests in its appearance. That force is individualized as a rhythm. What makes the difference between a force, one given force, and another force, the principle of individuation here is the rhythm of it. Every single force has its own particular rhythm, and that is what the art is able to capture. So because Senghor was meeting temple thought in emphasizing the notion of vital force, this encounter explains why he was so happy to read the book of Temples. This is the 50s and the 70s. Now I go faster. In the 70s, there was a strong reaction to that kind of literature that had been inaugurated by Father Temple's Bantu philosophy. A younger generation of philosophers reacted against it, against the model it represented, based on a certain number of points. One important point in particular was that you could not have something like a collective philosophy, Bantu philosophy, they would say, doesn't make sense. If you talk about French philosophy, it would be, you would quote given French philosophers who have written individually under their names and are taking responsibilities for a certain number of theses. How could you consider a collective something like an ethnic philosophy? That was one of the main criticism against the book by Temples. So the critique called the approach of Temples ethno-philosophy. You cannot be basis for philosophy. One argument that was made in particular by Beninese philosopher Paulin Huntonji is that in oral cultures, human memory is so preoccupied with retaining and transmitting that it does not criticize. In other words, if philosophical attitude and posture is by definition critical, you cannot criticize something that you have to transmit at the same time that you are eager to keep it, to retain it in order to be able to transmit it. So they would say orality is fundamentally anti-philosophical in its attitude. And third argument, which summarizes the two, you cannot say that philosophy is just the emanation of a culture. On the contrary, if we look back at our common ancestor as philosophers, Socrates himself, Socrates actually distanced himself from the culture, and that distancing, within that distancing, is philosophy itself. So that was the reaction to the expression African philosophy and the debate around the very use of that expression. What was missed in the controversies, and it was very heated controversy in the 70s and the early 80s, but what was missing is precisely the history, the intellectual history of great parts of Africa, particularly the Islamized regions of Africa. And if I look at my own region, West Africa, the region that was known as Sudan, actually Sudan is south of Egypt, but in the West Africa was also called Sudan for the same reason, because this was a shortening of Bilad Sudan, the land of the black people. So if you look at the Bilad Sudan, you understand one simple truth, which is that African cultures are not married with orality. It is an ethnologist reflex to think of African cultures as oral culture. But the debate on orality as it took place had simply ignored or failed to take into account the history of written erudition, and I am using that tautological expression for reasons that are evident now, the written erudition in important regions of the continent. Erudition should be understood here as referring to written erudition. And one thinks of the cities that were witness to this written culture, in particular the legendary Timbuktu in Mali. It is after the attack on North Mali that a larger audience realized that you had this rich tradition of written erudition when people were afraid for the manuscripts that were precisely kept in Timbuktu. And this culture is linked to the Islamization of a large part of the continent since the beginnings of the development of the Muslim religion on the land at the end of the 7th century, of the 8th century. It was then, during what is called the Middle Ages, that Islamization translated in an important manner into the development of written erudition that carried to Timbuktu, Gao, Djenné, and Koki, restraining myself to West Africa, the effects of the translatio studii that had spread from Athens and the centers of Greek and Hellenistic philosophy towards intellectual places such as Nishapur, Baghdad, Cordoba, Alexandria in this very country, and Cairo afterwards. And this is why it is important not to see, as Hegel did, the Sahara as a wall separating a northern Africa from a Africa proper. Because if you proceed with that division, you cannot understand the intellectual history of Africa at all. It becomes totally obscure then. One has to think philosophically about the history of philosophy on the continent, first to acknowledge the fact that the Sahara has always been crossed by routes from north to south and from west to east that were traveled by men and women, free or enslaved, pilgrims or students in search of science, books, paper, and other merchandise. From West Africa, for example, the traffic was quite intense towards Egypt. People who would go to pilgrimage to Mecca would stop here in Egypt, meet scholars at Al-Azhar, talk with them, stay a month usually, then go on their way back, make a stop again, and so on, so forth. So you have me for a while. That's what we do when we come from West Africa. The consequence of that was the development of an important literature, philosophical literature as well, that in centers, the kind of centers that I mentioned, not only in Arabic, but also in what is called Ajami, which is local languages using Arabic script. And that leads me to an important point concerning African philosophy. Precisely this question of languages. The languages that are spoken on the African continent are at the heart of what is discussed today by philosophers around this expression, African philosophy. The question now is that of making an equivalence between African philosophy and philosophy in the African languages. This is a double question. There is, as has just been said, the imperative of making these languages today languages of philosophy, of science, of literary creation, etc., and not confine them in private interaction. But also, and perhaps first of all, there is the question of what could be called the grammatical philosophy that these languages manifest. Let me quote here very quickly to explain what I mean by grammatical philosophy expressed by a language, the philosopher Nietzsche, who said this: where there is affinity of languages, it cannot fail owing to the common philosophy of grammar. I mean, owing to the unconscious domination and guidance by similar grammatical functions, that everything is prepared at the outset for similar development and sequence of philosophical systems, just as the way seems barred against certain other possibilities of word interpretation. Let me give you an example, a simple example to explain this better. Temples asked the question, what is being? He could have said very easily, oh, the question of being is the most important question, philosophical question one could pose. But you have to realize that the only reason you say that is because you are speaking a language in which you can use the verb to be, add ing, and have the substantive being. The way you can do this in Latin, you can do it with Greek, from einai to on, you can do it in French, être et étant, or être, and so on, so forth. So, what happens when you are speaking a language where you do not have that kind of use of the verb to be, which happens, by the way, to be the case of Arabic, of Hebrew, or of Wolof? In other words, there is something in the grammar itself, as Nietzsche says, that sort of predisposes philosophical system to go a certain way. As Nietzsche said, certain Indo-European languages have developed a philosophy of the subject in a way in which it was not the case in Ural Altaic languages and so on and so forth. That is one example that he gives. I am not continuing along those lines, we can discuss it later, but what I'm trying to say is that when you turn towards the use of African languages to translate philosophy or to write philosophy, and this is something that is being more and more done, then you realize that before there are concepts, the concepts we use in philosophy are words in a given language. And maybe sometimes what we consider to be a kind of universal problem is very much connected with the language in which we speak. What does that mean? That you could have two different consequences drawn from that. On the one hand, you could say you could have what I call a total separatist attitude, saying, well, each language or each family of language has its own philosophy connected to its philosophical grammar, as we might call it. Or that is the separatist way of doing things. Or another attitude would be to say, it is always important to speak radically different languages and to make the effort of translating our philosophical questions into totally different languages to see what happens to those philosophical problems, which is a way of doing our job as philosophers. We praise ourselves, philosophers, on the fact that we never leave anything unexamined, maybe except that we are speaking a language when we are speaking philosophically. And that would be a way, an extra way of examining the questions that we pose. This separatist attitude has its followers among African philosophers, one of them the most famous being Alexis Kagame. Alexis Kagame is a Rwandan philosopher who analyzed in 1956 Bantu languages the way, well, as a linguist, not the way that Father Temples did. And what he came up with was the radical contrast between what he called European philosophy or Western philosophy and Bantu philosophy, in a way that is parallel to what Temples did, but was not exactly the same, because, again, his conclusions came from a linguistic analysis of Bantu languages. What he looked at was Aristotle's categories. As you know, Aristotle has a list of 9 or 10 categories, depending on which book by Aristotle you look at, which are, simply explained, the different ways of speaking about being. If I say, This is water. That would be the substance water. Water, the quantity I have here is enough. The quality of the water is that it's very fresh. I could talk about the water being on my right and so on. In other words, the different ways of speaking about being is about what it is, the substance, then the quantity, the quality, the relation, the modality, the action, the passion, etc., and you have the picture. Now, all of these categories depend on the grammar of Greek. These are the different ways of using the verb to be in Greek. That is what Kagame was saying. And he says, well, maybe in our languages, from our languages, doing the kind of analysis that Aristotle actually did in his analytics would lead to different categories. That is what I call the separatist attitude. On the other hand, the translator's attitude was represented by Ghanaian philosopher Kwasi Wiredu, who tried precisely to translate famous philosophical problems into his own Akan language to see what happens to those problems and questions. Now, in philosophy, there is a wonderful text often quoted by analytic philosophers, which is a text by philosopher Alfred Tarski, defining truth. For a given statement to be true is for what it says, what it declares, to be the case. If I say it rains and the lady on my left turns her head and looks out and sees the rain, then I would have been right. What I said was true, otherwise it would be false. So the idea that a certain sentence is true if and only if it is what it says is the fact. And he looked at the translation of into Akan, and it did not make sense at all in Akan. Now, the fact that it did not make sense in itself was very interesting about the definition of truth. That definition of truth seemingly worked only in languages that had the same type of grammatical philosophy, of philosophical grammar, as Tarski's language or English, etc. In Akan, it did not make sense, which doesn't mean that in the end you do not translate. You can always translate anything. In translation, you always meet untranslatables, but in the end you always find your way around the untranslatable, and you find your way. So translation is this impossible operation that is always, in the end, performed at the end. But doing that translation, going from a language to another language, you learn something about the philosophical problem, and you learn something about your own Akan language. And somehow you also learn something about English. And that is the position that I consider even more philosophical than the separatist position. Separatism is a dead end. What would you say? Okay, they have their philosophy because they have their language. We have our philosophy because we have our language. The best way to go is to say, here is what it means to live between languages, to think from a language to a language, as I put that expression in my own work. And this is what I am advocating for African philosophers, to give a content, substance to that expression, African philosophy. Be translators. African philosophers, by their very position, must be translators, that is to say, must live between languages, must locate their philosophizing in between languages. And in fact, this is the case for all philosophers. Bilingualism should be a requirement of philosophy, and I will conclude on that point. You know that Plato, in his Academia, had this motto: you can't enter if you're not a geometer. You have to do mathematics. You were talking about me doing that. I was just being a Platonist. You have to do mathematics in order to understand philosophy. We could imagine the utopia, which would consist in saying that one should not be doing philosophy if one does not know a radically other language than their own. So all American philosophers would be then out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that stimulating and I feel personally pointed to in that particular lecture. Professor Diagne would be pleased to take some questions from the audience, and there are several people walking around with microphones who can help you with that. Our first question over there.
Should I go?
Please.
Yeah. Thank you. That was an amazing lecture, and I'm really grateful that you came all the way to share with us your thoughts. I'm very much interested actually in whether the attitude of translatability is even possible in the first place, not endorsing necessarily separatism, but that the experience of incommensurability sometimes is the dominant fact of our lives, precisely because of relations of domination, for instance. Fanon, when he speaks about the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, he presents a world which is very Manichaean, where actually the consciousness of the colonized doesn't exist until he goes through the cleansing act of violence of decolonization. So as long as these facts of domination and power exist, then the idea of translatability is actually not even possible. That's not a separatist attitude, that's more of a, let's say, a call for, let's finish decolonization first, and then we talk about translatability. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is a very important question because you put your finger on something which is what I would call the paradox of translation. I am someone who believes in translation, and my current work is about translation. And my point is to consider that translation is a way of creating reciprocity. If you put languages in touch with each other, putting them in touch, to use an expression from the philosopher of translation, Antoine Berman, is a way of creating equality and reciprocity. Now, I am not being naive, and you are perfectly right pointing that in translation itself is about domination. Actually, if you look at which language is translated into which language, then you can see fully the structure of domination. In particular, the space of domination par excellence, which is the colonial space, where you have imperial language and dominated language. And you are right, Kagame's gesture was a decolonizing gesture. The gesture of someone who says, well, here you are, speaking your own imperial language, giving the impression that your language is naturally the incarnation of the universal. It is the logos itself, incarnated. And that somehow nothing exists if it is not translated into your own imperial language. And here I am, looking actually deconstructing your own pretense to universality, what you are considering to be Aristotelian expression of the grammar of thought, the very laws of thought, the laws of valid reasoning, is nothing but the grammar of his own Greek language, which then could be challenged by the grammar of another given language. You are affirming, by doing that, he is affirming the equivalence of the languages, and that separatist attitude, you are right, cannot be understood outside of that context. It is a gesture of refusal. And you are also right pointing to Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon is the one who said that colonialism is by itself a violence. And against violence, the only response is violence. So the violence of separatism as a response to the violence of imposition of an imperial language which presents itself as the language of the Logos itself. I'm considering that we are in a post-colonial situation, although this could be discussed, where the equivalence of languages is something that we accept probably more easily now, living in a post-Bandung type of situation. So that would be my response, and thank you for pointing that aspect of translation.
I think there's a question down here in the front. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Sim. I just asked to speak to welcome Professor Bachir Diagne in Cairo, as we were always in Dakar as friends since 20 years. I'm welcoming you first of all, and to see we had a lot of arguments and discussions in Dakar. He was very helpful, a real philosopher in Dakar in West Africa, and within Codicria, that is the Council for Developing Social Science in Africa based in Dakar. We had fellowship together or in the university also. Then I know him as a real philosopher in Senegal and on the whole Africa, what we call Francophone Africa, but he is now in the Anglophone, not American Anglophone anyhow.
Living between languages.
Different language. That is the first, then that is the point. That we had in Cairo on 1966, I think, Senghor, president and philosopher Senghor in Cairo University. We attended, and his lecture is very important one, and printed in English, French, and Arabic, I think. Then he put us in, you are this evening putting us with the other, the dialogue with the other, in between African philosophy and the other philosophers and so. But he put us with this negritude, Arabism, and so. Where in your lecture, of course there are a lot of points, that your lecture is very rich with from languages, oral culture, and ethnology, and anthropology, and so on. So I can't go ahead more, yeah. I'm just asking you to speak about the negritude of Senghor. Was recognizing the other also by this way, or different thing with Bantuism, for example? He even couldn't connect the negritude with the Bantuism. That is very strange. And then it is your time now, as you had a lot on the Islamic philosophy also, and I would like it to be prominent in this lecture, but we are expecting you here. I ask Professor Steve to, because we had to discuss it. You have a certain attitude in studying the Islamic philosophy, but we had now a problem with political Islam, and that put the whole thing in trouble. Yeah. But by the way, Bachir or Diagne, Bachir has put this, you have to read it. We also translated one of his book into Arabic, but he has in French, of course, yeah. I am, anyhow, in the end, I'm thinking thank you for the AUC to host you, to invite you to Cairo, and thank you personally to accept and to come. You are welcome anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helmi, for that. I know that what you said out of friendship. Of course, we have known each other for. Now, nobody will believe me if I say that I had my 20th anniversary here. You are right. I mean, the comparison with Senghor. Senghor was, of course, the philosopher of negritude, what it means to be black. And he sort of had a philosophy of recomposing, of remembering the African continent out of the Hegelian vivisection of it by considering that Africa was the addition of negritude plus what he called Arabity, etc. What I'm saying, contrary to that, you do not need to have separate entities and try to recompose them. In fact, if you pay attention to the history of Islamic philosophy, of what is known in Arabic as falsafa, if you look at the history of falsafa, then you reconstitute the intellectual unity of the continent in a way that is not an addition of societies or cultures, etc., etc., because you had this intellectual continuity that would come from Greece even, all the way down to Timbuktu. In Europe, this notion of translatio studii, the idea that was constructed in the Middle Ages that Europe was the hair of Greece, okay? So you would have Athens, Rome, and Heidelberg, or London, or, you know, or Sorbonne, or Paris. This was a construction that corresponded, they did not correspond to the tours and detours actually really made by the translatio studii, because you had Athens, okay, but Athens through Nishapur, Edesse, Baghdad, Timbuktu, Cordoba, Fez, Kairawin, Timbuktu. So the notion of translatio studii should be complicated. We should rewrite, and this is one of the consequences of what I was saying, we should rewrite the history of philosophy in a way that is different from the way in which it is written in textbooks. In textbooks, you have antiquity, you have the Greek miracle. A miracle is always convenient because a miracle is preceded by nothing. It was born out of itself. So you have the Greek miracle continued by the Romans, and then it went through Europe. Now you have in the middle these people with Arabic sounding names. Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, what do you make of them? You say, okay, they were there, but they received the heritage and handed it to the true heirs of it, which is Europe. This is the Hegelian construction of the philosophy of spirit, which was an ethnic cleansing of the history of philosophy. So basically what I'm doing here is re-ethnicize the history of philosophy, and thank you so much. Glad to be in your country.
Question here, and okay. Sorry, I'll try to keep track of them there.
A quick comment, then a question. Graham Greene's novel, The Heart of the Matter, you also have a book in there called A Bishop Among the Bantus. So there's a connection there as well. They're very universal, popular people. If language can create problems of balancing acts in grammatical philosophy, how about doing away with language at all and focusing on art? Because I was reading a book on philosophy of Islamic art, an Arabic book, and they're saying they didn't have pictorial representations of God, and de-emphasizing pictures, focusing on geometry and colors, abstract kind of art. And it sounds a lot like the African art and rhythm, and also connecting when their pictures to music, to sounds. Is that another avenue that we can use to get around these language problems?
Well, right. I mean, if we say language is a problem, what do we mean by language is a problem? If we mean by that full communication is not happening, it is the very nature of language, I believe, to have certain opacity, but then to also be open. In other words, when I say that translation is this impossible thing that in the end still succeeds in happening, I believe in a kind of communication which doesn't mean necessarily absolute transparency, but negotiation, continuous negotiation and understanding through untranslatable, through misunderstanding, working out one kind of communication. And in that sense, translation is the language of languages, as Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o famously wrote. Or to generalize, also this is what Umberto Eco said when he declared that the language of Europe is translation. One could expand it to the whole world and say that language of the world is translation. Now, art would be, yes, a form of universal language, the language of forms. But again, you translate those forms. They mean something for you because of your own perspective on them. Let me give you an example which has to do with African art and Africa. It is known that Picasso was influenced by what was called art nègre in France at that time, the vogue of African art in France. Shall we call that an influence? No. Picasso was looking for something at the time, famously in 1906, when he was painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is at MoMA, when you, by the way. So he was looking for something, and this is the moment when the fact that he was an art collector himself, and he was collecting African art at that time, sort of found its way into its own art, when he erased the faces that he had been doing and redoing again, and decided to replace all the faces on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by African masks. This language spoke to him, but because he had his own questions bringing them there, the language of the forms talked to him in a way is the language of the computers. Everything can be translated into 0 and 1s, but once they are reinterpreted, we find ourselves with our own languages again. But in the end, I believe more in translation, and the problems are not necessarily a bad thing. Misunderstanding and encountering the untranslatable is probably part of the communication, human communication.
Okay, I'm trying to keep track of the questions. This gentleman, then Doris, and then Ikai.
Thank you for this amazing lecture. A number of years ago in the 60s, my wife and I were both being trained as linguists, and we were being trained basically as what we were derisively called topological linguists when Chomsky was doing the deep structure. But we spent a number of years in West Africa, and while we were doing translation, there arose a kind of a process there of doing it, which was called then dynamic equivalence. Mm-hmm. And you used the word equivalence. And one of the things that occurred to me there was we never assumed that we were masters of the language we were translating. We always worked with an informant. Not an informer, but an informant.
Right.
And the object was finding out through a discourse between the two of us, or the three of us, and the community itself, what would be a way to say something in your language which would mean to you what saying it my way in my language means to me. And that, we call that dynamic equivalence.
Right,
and
right.
So I appreciate hearing this coming from a philosophical point of view as well as a linguistic.
Right, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that comment, and it is exactly what I was trying to articulate also, yeah.
That also sounds to me like 43 years of marriage, so. Doris, please.
No, I was going to ask a rather silly question about math, but he said...
Can you speak into the microphone a little more?
What would it mean to you? How would you know what it means to you if you have to say it in your own language? I mean, it's that in itself is another thing to translate the words that you're using to say what you meant by the other words. And
right.
The question I was going to ask was, would it be simpler in mathematics, for instance, in whatever language, 2 + 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, would have to have some kind of a similar understanding, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, indeed, and this is, you're absolutely right. Mathematics, by definition, is a universal language. If I go to the blackboard and I start writing, let's say, a second-degree equation, and I start solving it, looking at the roots, if I say nothing, everybody who has basic understanding of algebra would follow what I'm doing. Suppose I comment in Wolof what I'm doing, I would be the only one understanding myself. But what I would be doing then is just use a meta language on top of the mathematical language, which is no problem at all. Mathematics is probably the easiest language to translate into any other language because it is always translated. What needs translation is basically the meta language itself. But then you do not communicate in mathematics. The difference with our natural human, all too human languages is precisely that because we say something in those languages, because we write fictions in those languages, we create in those languages carry with them the possibility of untranslatability, the possibility of misunderstanding, because they are very different. Even two languages as so close to each other as French and English. I'm always fascinated, having learned English from my own French language among my different languages. I am always fascinated by the way in which the weight of meaning in English is put on all the propositions like up, down, etc., while the weight of meaning in French is on the verb. Everybody who learns English from French has that kind of difficulty, figuring out up, down, back, force, etc., etc., because no verbs means nothing if it is not accompanied by those elements of the language. So there lies the possibility of misunderstanding, but also there lies the very price and value of translation. Mathematics is translated and it is useless. It is like having a series of 0 and 1, solving that equation. Yes, we understand each other. And that would be the difference between what Leibniz and other logicians have called philosophical grammar. Leibniz and logicians like George Boole, I was talking about George Boole earlier, to speak of mathematics, they were all looking for the universal language that would overcome all possibility of misunderstanding. And they found that universal language in the language of algebra, which was transferred to the language of our computers. Our computers today speak that universal language, but it becomes something for us only when it is interpreted in our own languages, and so we are stuck with our natural languages. The case of Esperanto would be something different, but again, who writes novels in Esperanto?
Who reads them? Ikai has been very patient.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. And you know, as someone who talks about Greek philosophy in English, whose native language is neither, I feel very encouraged by your thesis that translating is a fundamental act of philosophizing. So, you know, like, I'm not very sympathetic with the separatists, but I do kind of want to, you know, like, kind of engage with this understanding exactly what's the argument backing them up. Because it seems like if I choose the side of translation, I'm fine with accepting that there are certain things that are hard to translate, or there are certain limits of translation, and what we should try to do is to continually attempt to overcome it. So it seems like if I'm an anti-separatist, I accept that in principle languages are translatable, while acknowledging that there are certain limits to translation. Would you say that if I want to be a separatist, then I'm committed to saying that what's untranslatable is the more important part? For example, if I'm a separatist, am I committed to the position that, oh, when you translate Bantu philosophy into French, something's lost. And when you talk about it in English, of his French version, something is lost. Is a separatist committed to that position? Or do you think actually a separatist has other reasons besides untranslatability to insist on his position?
I would consider that the separatist has exactly that position. Let me give you an example that is given by Kagame himself, the quintessential separatist. He says, well, when I read Descartes' cogito, it is untranslatable in my language. In other words, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, what Kagame says is that you cannot have that absolute construction of the verb to be in the languages that I am dealing with, because you have to say, I am what? I think, therefore I am tall, short. You have to say, I am what? You do not use it in an absolute sense. And he says, he stops at that, saying it is untranslatable. What I'm saying is that he's wrong. I don't know his particular language, but I am sure you can find a way around it. Even if you have to put a long footnote and explain something about, you know, the fact that the language I'm translating from has this absolute use of I am. So you can, my point is that separatism in that sense is a starting point. You have to acknowledge that if you say the beginning of philosophy is Parmenides, being is, non-being is not, it's not necessarily something that makes sense for everybody. But trying to make sense of it in a language where you do not use the verb to be in that way is something to be, from which we gain something. This is why I believe in sort of overcoming the separatist attitude.
So it almost feels like you agree with certain insights they have, but you want to turn the...
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? Over here. And then Lauren is next, and then, yes.
Thank you very much for your coming, and welcome, Cairo. Actually, you started your lecture in a very enthusiastic way that we are thinking about the question is of what is the African, in order to understand what is the African philosophy. But actually you ended up imprisoning us in the question of language. But actually the question of the African philosophy had many wide attempts in order to reformulate it. You started with that Africa, or African philosophy, or African knowledge, is the knowledge on Africa as an object. So everyone who is talking about Africa can make African knowledge. So we can get into the problem of translation, because at the end of the day, you're going to have non-Africans who are working in Africa. Mm-hmm. But Pauline Hontonji, that you have mentioned, have said another trend. They said that actually we do not need to go into this way of formulating African knowledge, but say that African knowledge is knowledge by Africans. It's not knowledge on Africa. So at this moment, we're not going to be imprisoned in the idea of translation, because at the end of the day, they are all Africans. They do not need to translate. Okay? The third attempt, which gives many potentials and opens our vision into African philosophy more better, and will not restrict things into it's going to be translated or not, and all these dualities, is the idea made by Kwasi Wiredu and Henry Udera Oroka. Kwasi Wiredu said that actually we are in need of tradition. Why don't Africans think of what is unique in the tradition philosophy, in the tradition of African philosophy? So we have the way open in order to talk about a tradition of African philosophy, more wider than the problems or the problematics of language. And Henry Udera Oroka, you have the psych philosophy. This is a rich work that we going to study the wise people in our tribes, the wise people in our nations. All these attempts tries to open the vision how to study African philosophy. We are not in African philosophy restricted on the idea of language. We have language, we have the idea of tradition, we have our wise people, we have our own new ways opened by Wiredu again for thinking about a way of tradition. What is unique? We still have this question unanswered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The idea of being unique, and it is interesting that the three philosophers that you mentioned, the Beninese Paul Hontonji, the Ghanaian Kwasi Wiredu, and the Kenyan Henry Udera Oroka, they shared the same question about what it means for a philosophy to be African. They started, actually, the three of them, a journal in the mid-70s with the title Consequence. And as is the case for many African journals, you had one issue of that, and then they ran out of money. But you are absolutely right, indicating that these three took three different directions in African philosophy. Paulin, at that time, was essentially a Marxist. What he wanted to do was to clear out the whole Bantu philosophy, ethno-philosophical approach, in order to, because he believed that you cannot have philosophy if you do not have science. He was a student of Althusser, as I was myself a few years later, and Althusser had taught us that philosophy has no history, ideology has no history. History happens on the ground, in the material things and in science. And somehow philosophy is a reflection of what is happening on the ground in science. And Paulin was very much, when he wrote his book on Sur la philosophie africaine, on African philosophy, he was into that. And so he wanted to clear the whole space from ethno-philosophy and approach it in that case. You are right also mentioning Odera Oruka and late Odera Oruka, who had that kind of ethnographical approach. Let's go see the people, the sage people, and ask them, what do you think about what is death for you, etc., in pursuit of something which is somehow uniquely African. I would just add to your comment, for which I thank you very much, that I am very wary of an expression, something which is uniquely or specifically something. In other words, and this is why I believe in translation, if something is authentically philosophical, I believe in its universalization through negotiation and through translation. Let me give you an example. The concept of vital force that was used by temples and considered to be something valid by Senghor. Temples made that contrast that I mentioned earlier, separating, and we come back to separatism, separating radically what he considered a European static ontology versus an African dynamic ontology of the vital force. In the end, he came back from that separation because he said, well, after all, these Bantu people speak the language of force, force being given, force being increased. What does it tell me about my own faith and the text I believe in, which is the gospel? And he said, in the end, I came to convert the Bantus, but finally they are the ones who taught me something about the way in which I should understand my own gospel. I should understand the way in which Christ says, follow me, I'll give you life, and I'll give you life in abundance. This is a quote from the gospel. And he said, well, actually, that is the logos. The first logos is that logos, that vibrating, living logos that could be identified to a force, and not what logos has become afterwards in Aristotle's categories, when it became sort of petrified, immobilized as something permanent to which attributes, predicates would be attributed from outside. And so what he presented as the specific philosophy of the Bantus turned out to be the human experience in general. In other words, I do believe that any particularity, when you dig it and when you comprehend it, becomes something that speaks to human experience and human condition. That's what I would add. But I thank you very much for those references.
Lauren?
Hi. One of the colors that I heard in your lecture today, as it related to philosophy, our constant grapple with philosophy and how we defined it, was spirituality and this power of the word. And it took me back to my undergraduate years at Spelman College, where I studied about African women writers and philosophers. And so looking at the concept of philosophy and going into the rationale of the everyday lives of people, the everyday duties of women, the everyday conceptions of how people grapple with their own personal experience, and in various West African traditions, the feminine force, various feminine deities, and how communities interpret them in their own existence. And it reminded me of one of your own countrywomen, Mariama Ba, and her book, So Long a Letter, and her creating this letter based on her experience as an African woman, West African woman, in a patriarchal society, dealing with the issues of class, of status, of all these issues, but her using her experience to, in a way, create her own philosophy. So I guess the question I would like to pose to you or ask, is it possible if you could describe, particularly from your country, Senegalese women, in what way has women's experiences, women's daily lives contributed to this thing called African philosophy?
That's a great, infinite question. Let me come back to what you said about Mariama Ba, and I'm so happy that you raised the case of what she said. And I connect what you said about her to what you said about words being power. Words are force. Words matter, and they make a change. They act. If you remember that in the novel is a letter, and we find out at the end that this strong woman actually herself comes to literature. When she tells her friend who is in Canada, I believe, in the US, that she is going to write. And so at the end we understand that somehow what she wrote is what she said at the end of the novel that she was going to write. Turning her life, transfiguring her life, transmuting it into the force of words, I think is an experience that we learn from, I was going to say Senegalese women, but I mentioned that I do not believe in specificity. So let me say West African women in general, or women on this continent. The force of life is somehow to be understood through them in various ways. And art has captured that. The best representation in African art of the force of life is usually the representation of the feminine figure. So that's part of the infinite answer that could be brought to your question. Thank you.
I think we have time for just one more question, then we'll have
I want to thank you for not only a very stimulating lecture, but stimulating answers to interesting questions. I'm an Egyptologist who studies ancient Egypt, and it's often said that ancient Egyptians had no philosophy. There is no philosophy for pharaonic Egypt. If I understand what you're saying, in part, there's a human capacity for thinking and a human capacity for language, and somehow that engenders philosophy. But I don't quite understand what you mean by philosophy. Sometimes you seem to be saying it's words, sometimes spirit. So I wonder if you could maybe leave us with a thought about what you think philosophy is. Thank you.
Yes, what is philosophy?
It'll have to be a short answer if you can.
Well, obviously when you do philosophy you use concepts, but I believe in concepts being put to work. Let me give you one single example coming from South Africa. Ubuntu, the famous concept of Ubuntu as it has been put to work precisely by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu when they were faced with the problem of creating a new so-called rainbow nation out of the ruins of apartheid. Because what do you do if you had communities that were so separated by years and years, decades of hatred? What happens? So when they say that we have to use Ubuntu and enshrine it in our constitution. First of all, use it in the Commission, Truth and Reconciliation, and then enshrine it in our constitution. Would you say, okay, they took a concept from African philosophy, Bantu philosophy, which was Ubuntu, and they applied it? I don't believe in that. Ubuntu was not yet a philosophical concept before they put it to work in the way in which it worked. In other words, African philosophy is not a stock of ready-made philosophies that you would just excavate and say, oh, by the way, this is a wall of philosophy. It is putting a concept to work because you face a problem in the present, today, for tomorrow in South Africa, and you say, well, there is this Bantu word, which means being human together, creating our humanness together. And you say, okay, this is going to mean this. We need the truth about killings, about people disappearing, etc., etc. But we need the truth for building a future of a nation that would be reconciled. And this is exactly what Ubuntu does. So on the very day where they decided that this is what Ubuntu does, somehow Ubuntu became a philosophical concept. That is how I would explain this. So yes, it is a word of the language, and it becomes a philosophical concept when you put it to work like that. And now it has become a universal concept of transitional justice. Legal scholars and philosophers who work on transitional justice know the concept, use it, and it is now common use. So let me just give that response to another infinite question of what is philosophy.
A wonderful concluding remark. There's a reception outside where we can continue talking about these very interesting ideas, but please join me in thanking Professor Diagne for this wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Can I ask everybody please to turn their cell phones to silent mode? I think I'll do that myself, actually. On the off chance that somebody calls me. Don't do that. Okay, good evening and welcome to the 11th Edward Said Memorial Lecture. This series was initiated by my colleague Farrell Hazul shortly after Edward's death, and this year's lecture is generously supported by the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, that is Nathaniel Bowditch, to whom we are very grateful. I also want to acknowledge Hoda and Nadia Gindi of Cairo University's English Department. Hoda's here today. Childhood friends of Edward who are here and also support the lecture series. Finally, I want to thank my administrative staff, Ola Shanab and Omnea Ali, and all of our graduate fellows for their hard work coordinating this event. Thank you very much. I'm Stephen Nimitz of AUC's Department of English and Comparative Literature, and it's a real privilege for me to be here and to introduce our speaker this evening and to welcome all of you members of the community of Cairo. Thank you for coming. Before I get to tonight's speaker, I want to give the names of previous guests who have delivered the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. These are David Damrosch, Cornell West, Terry Eagleton, Rokas de Groot, Judith Butler, John Carlos Rowe, Michael Wood, Sari Makdisi, Marina Warner, and Leila Abulagod. I know that Edward would be honored by that list of names, as he is by our speaker tonight, Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Professor Diagne is currently chair of French and Romance Philology at Columbia University, a position that he took in 2008 after having taught philosophy for many years at Sheikh Anta Diop University in his native Senegal, and then at Northwestern University. He also served in Senegal as counselor for education and culture, and he has a broad range of experience and interventions in the public sphere, where he has deployed his considerable academic acumen on many important causes, especially on behalf of universal human rights. And thus, he is a very appropriate choice for tonight's lecture. Professor Diagne has been recognized for his public service and for his teaching and research by many awards and honors in France, Senegal, and in the US, including the Koldyke Outstanding Teacher Professorship, the Alfasi Prize in the Social Sciences and the Humanities, the Edouard Glissant Prize, and the Daniel Bouveret Prize. Professor Diagne studied philosophy and mathematics at the Sorbonne, writing a doctoral thesis on Georges Boole's Algebra of Logic. This will be the only Edward Said lecture with math questions will be allowed. And not only allowed, but definitively answered, perhaps. Since then, his work and interest have branched into many fields of study, including the history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, African philosophy and literature, Sufism in the Islamic world, and 20th century French philosophy. Of his many award-winning books, those that have been translated into English include African Art as Philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, and the Idea of Negritude, Islam and Open Society, Fidelity and Movement in the Philosophy of Muhammad Iqbal, and finally, The Ink of the Scholars, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa in 2016. This last work is available online as a free download at the Codercia site, and we thank you for that. We really appreciate that here in Egypt. The subtitle of that work, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa, is also the title of his talk this evening. Please welcome Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne.
Thank you very much, Stephen. To be invited to deliver this year the Edward Said Memorial Lecture at this prestigious university in American University in Cairo is indeed a great honor, for which I would like to express my gratitude to everybody who invited me and who made my visit possible, and particularly you, Steve, for having made everything smooth, even if I did my best to complicate things for you. And I would like to thank you all for being present here. 3 reasons make me particularly happy to be bestowed such an honor. First,